So I've talked about how there's no single best sword. Perfection is a lofty, abstract goal that can never be fully reached, not even by Cell.
You know, you're not wrong.
Which is not to say that all designs are created equal. Some are better than others, especially for particular purposes in certain circumstances. But there is a time period that, in my opinion, contains the height of sword evolution, at least in Europe specifically. Let me show you. Here we have several hand-and-a-half swords. This one is in particular quite interesting because if not for the handle length, it looks like a rapier. So this is, I would almost call this a rapier longsword hybrid. Sort of. And there's a basket-hilted sword. This one has quite a tall crossguard. And there is a complex hilted longsword. Or again, hand and a half, I suppose is a better way to put it. I think the term hand and a half can be a little bit nebulous sometimes, but in this case it's fairly obvious because of the riser right there. So you can see that's a section for the main hand, and then you can hold on to it further up as well. In my opinion, these are pretty much the height of at least longswords. Obviously you have a long evolution of swords and sabers after that, but to me this is basically the apex. Also in terms of craftsmanship. Not that you don't have well-made, beautiful weapons from later times, but this in particular, there's just something about it. I could just be biased, but just in terms of the evolution of swords, it's at least the height of complexity. Admittedly, I'm using a clumsily literal interpretation of the height of evolution in the sense that evolution is seen as a development from less to more complex. So a complex hilt is, by that definition, more evolved, at least on a literal level. Now, I'm not discrediting earlier designs. There is a wealth of well-made, beautiful swords of great historical importance. But there's a distinctive increase in quality, complexity, and variety from the early to the late Middle Ages, which in my opinion reaches its peak in the Renaissance. What about later swords, though? Metallurgy kept improving, especially, of course, toward and beyond the Industrial Revolution. And melee weapons weren't entirely phased out, even when firearms reigned supreme. Sabers were still made and used during the First World War, after all. And I'm guessing some people would argue that later military sabers eclipsed Renaissance swords. Personally, I don't think they can quite rival the impressiveness of the best that Renaissance craftsmanship had to offer, or the height of functional complexity, which makes sense because it was the last era in which melee weapons retained this much importance, at least in Europe. Firearms had already cemented their role on the battlefield, but they hadn't yet overshadowed melee weapons as the primary form of offense. Of course, there are always exceptions, like Scottish Highland warriors still using basket-hilted swords in the Baroque and beyond, but I mean the general trend overall. There were still swords with basket hilts and other elaborate designs in the 17th century and after, but they didn't push the envelope the way sword development did in the 15th and 16th century. There was just nothing more to add, really. There were changes on a smaller scale, and they kept alternating between different blade shapes, like straight or curved, wider, narrower, thicker, thinner, etc. But at that point, the way I see it, everything that makes functional sense had already been done pretty much. Which, of course, is not to say that every Renaissance-era sword was perfect and everything before and after was worse. There was a lot of experimentation that didn't lead anywhere long-term, like all the weird combination weapons and whatnot. Although, that's something they kept doing anyway. The willingness to experiment also brought us the staggering variety of designs to choose from. And when you cherry-pick the best of the best from that time period, I don't think it gets any better. Interesting. There's a longsword with sort of a Pappenheimer-style guard that you wouldn't normally expect on a rapier. It has those distinctive-looking cutouts. Interesting pommel shape, too. In the Renaissance, you get so much more variation. In some older time periods, you can classify swords a little bit more easily and set up a typology. There's way more variety at this time. Yeah, next to it, again, a complex hilt. This one has a knuckle guard that only goes halfway through. And that is often the main target. Sometimes you can target the bottom hand too, but that is more important to protect. Okay, that's interesting. The guard on this one right there to the right, the left side is straight and the right side is curved. Curved toward the camera. Let's see, hopefully you can see that. That is quite odd. I can't say I've seen that before. Pretty much a 90-degree bend, so I would assume that's intentional for some reason. There, you have very obviously dedicated anti-armor swords. I mean, it doesn't get more obvious than that. Look at this. So you have a pretty thick blade, diamond cross-section, so it's nice and stiff, extremely narrow. So you have a longsword hilt attached to a needle, essentially, an armor-breaking needle. And in fact, the one next to it on the left, that is almost even more obvious. That could even be a triangular, it is a triangular cross-section. So it's flat on the inside, or backside, however you want to look at it, a very pronounced ridge in the center. So that gives you an extremely stiff blade. That is a pretty classic example of an estoc. So you sacrifice any chance of using cuts at all. I mean, you could still bash someone with it, obviously, but this is really a thrusting sword, primarily. And there we've got a hunting sword, aka Kriegsmesser. I mean, technically it's not, obviously. If it's a hunting sword, it's not for war, but you would call this a Kriegsmesser in the way we typologize things now. You can see it has a very characteristic pommel shape. Well, pommel cap, I suppose. Those decorative panels in the grip are quite interesting. And they have a checkered pattern. And again, there's so much detail. It's a Swiss saber. There's just something about it. Again, complex hilt. Yes, I like complexity, but it's not just that. It's not just the fact that it protects your hands and that it's more elaborate craftsmanship. It's also just aesthetically very pleasing. I also had a chance to handle a fantastic reproduction from Todd's workshop. And although it's a bit heavier than other longswords due to the extra mass in the hilt, it's properly balanced and moves well. There's just one thing about it that feels a little awkward, and that is how skinny the handle gets toward the pommel. It doesn't fill the hand very well. It's one of those swords that are single-edged, but also kind of not. The false edge is fully sharpened there. In fact, I would even call this functionally double-edged, pretty much, because that's the part that you cut with. You wouldn't cut any higher than that. This longsword here looks like it has a ring on one side, and I'm not really sure if I would call that a shell guard or an oversized nagel. Kind of the latter. But either way, so it looks almost like a Kriegsmesser guard on a longsword. Again, not like they were that obsessed with the terminology. The sword that the reproduction town guard that I've owned, in fact, two of which I've owned, is based on. It makes me think that they did quite a good job with that, both Arms and Armor and LK Chen. It's very close. These rapiers here are also quite nice. There's a good look at the blade profile as well. You can see it's much thicker at the base. That's primarily where you want to parry. It's just where you have the most stability in terms of leverage. As said, maybe I'm just biased, but I'm interested to know what you think. What's the height of sword evolution in your mind? Thanks for watching and take care, folks.